I remember the exact moment when everything in my life felt like it was quietly on fire, though I didn't know it yet. It was a Tuesday, February 14th, 2017, and the city was soaked in that weird kind of rain that makes everything feel heavier, colder, and lonelier than it should. I had just finished my shift at the local grocery store in Queens, New York, where I'd been working for nearly 3 years, stacking cans and bagging groceries, smiling at strangers, pretending everything was fine. My hands still smelled faintly of canned tomatoes and bleach, and the ache in my shoulders was familiar, a constant companion I could neither ignore nor escape. Back then, my life felt small, suffocating even, but I didn't mind so much. I had a routine, and routines are comforting in their monotony. I had my tiny studio apartment above a laundromat on 47th Avenue, where the neon lights flickered and hummed at all hours. It wasn't much, but it was mine. My rent was barely manageable, and most nights I'd sit on the peeling linoleum floor with a plate of rice and whatever cheap vegetables I could find, scrolling through Instagram on my second-hand phone, watching people live lives I could only dream about. I had one person who made that cramped little world feel alive: Mara. Mara Thompson. She was everything I wasn't: blindingly confident, effortlessly stylish, and magnetic in a way that made people notice her, even in a crowded subway car. She worked at a boutique a few blocks away, selling designer clothes she could never afford but wore with such conviction that it almost didn't matter. I met her at a friend's birthday party, a cramped, humid apartment on Roosevelt Street, and I was immediately hooked. She laughed at the right moments, teased with a sharp wit that always made me feel like she was letting me in on some secret I wasn't supposed to know. I won't lie, I fell hard, maybe too hard. My life was small, my world predictable, but she made it feel alive. The way she talked about Paris like she'd lived there, the way she could quote lines from old movies, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about things she loved, it made me feel like I could step out of my cardboard life and actually breathe. But there was always this tension, a subtle thread of imbalance I tried to ignore. She was honest about her preferences. Money mattered to her, style mattered, status mattered. She wasn't cruel about it, at least not overtly at first, but I could feel the invisible line I would never cross. I remember once, over a late-night cup of coffee at that little diner on 9th Avenue, she laughed at my thrifted jacket. It wasn't a mean laugh, just a sharp little jab, playful but cutting. "You really wear that?" she asked, and I smiled, told her it was vintage, and tried not to notice the flicker of disappointment in her eyes. I brushed it off then. I told myself she was just teasing, that I was being insecure. But looking back, those little cracks were the first signs of something I couldn't yet name, something that would break me in ways I hadn't imagined. Life went on like this for months. I worked my shifts, she worked hers, we met for late-night walks or cheap dinners when we could afford it. I wasn't blind to the fact that she noticed wealth wherever it existed: wealthy friends, wealthy men in cafes, the way she lingered a little too long at designer storefronts, but I convinced myself it was normal, that it didn't mean anything about me. I wanted to believe love could bridge gaps like that feelings mattered more than wallets. Then came that night in May, a night that still feels like a knife in my chest when I think about it. It was warm, sticky, the city alive with the sound of traffic and the distant echo of a street performer playing saxophone under the bridge. Mara and I were walking back from a cheap diner, the kind where the neon sign buzzed and the ketchup packets were sticky in your pocket. She held my hand loosely, laughing at something I said, and I remember thinking, really thinking, that this was happiness. That maybe, finally, I had something that made the grind worth it. But there was a tension in her eyes I hadn't noticed before. A glint that told me she was weighing something, calculating. I didn't ask, not then. I wanted to freeze the moment, wanted to believe it was safe, that my world, small as it was enough. I remember the first time she mentioned him. It was casual, offhand. We were sitting on the edge of the pier by Long Island City, the smell of salt and gasoline hanging in the air. She laughed about a man she'd met at a gallery opening, this wealthy, smooth-talking guy named Julian. I forced a laugh, told her it sounded nice, and she smiled at me in a way that should have been reassuring but felt hollow instead. "He's different," she said lightly, and that was it. No further explanation. Just those 3 words that would plant a seed of doubt I couldn't shake. I went home that night, staring at the ceiling of my little studio, listening to the city hum beneath me. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, that she loved me for who I was, that money didn't matter in love. But my stomach churned, and sleep didn't come. I realized, painfully, that I was already losing. That my world, small as it was, wasn't enough for her. From that day on, things changed. The little jabs became sharper, the laughter a little less warm, the teasing edged with something cruelly knowing. She'd make comments about my job, about the apartment, about the food I cooked. Nothing overt, nothing that friends would notice, just enough to make me question myself, my choices, my worth. I remember sitting on the curb outside her apartment one night, the city lights reflecting in puddles from the rain, thinking maybe I wasn't enough. That maybe I never would be. I should have walked away then. I should have realized what I was dealing with. But love, or the idea of it, is stupidly blinding. I stayed. I believed. I hoped. By the summer, she was spending more and more time with Julian. I'd see him tagged in photos on her social media, sleek shots from gallery openings, rooftop parties, places I could never afford. And she'd post them with those little captions that were meant to be subtle, teasing me in a way that only I could feel. New experiences, she'd write, and I'd scroll past with a knot in my chest, pretending not to notice. Through all this, I clung to the moments that were ours, walking through Central Park in the fall, sharing a sandwich on the subway steps, laughing at some ridiculous YouTube video. I held on to them because I couldn't bear to let go of what I wanted, what I thought we had. I told myself she'd come back, that this was just a phase, that she was testing me, or maybe testing herself. But the cracks were widening. I could see them in her eyes, in the way she avoided my gaze when she smiled at Julian's photos, in the way she sometimes lingered on his messages before replying to mine. And yet, I told myself I was imagining things. Denial is easier than heartbreak. It all came to a head one cold night in November. The city had turned gray and brittle, the wind cutting through coats like knives. I had worked a double shift and was exhausted, but I met her at our usual diner anyway. She arrived late, makeup perfect, hair flawless, a smile that felt distant. She slid into the booth across from me, and for a moment, I thought maybe things would be okay. Then she mentioned Julian again. This time, the words weren't casual. They were deliberate, sharp, and heavy with meaning. She talked about the life he could give her, the apartment in Manhattan, the trips to Europe, the parties and connections. And for the first time, I felt the weight of reality press down on me, crushing me from the inside out. I remember my hands trembling, my stomach tightening, and the coffee in front of me suddenly tasting bitter, acrid, like betrayal itself. That night, walking home through the drizzle, I realized the person I loved didn't love me in the way I needed. She loved what I couldn't give her, and she had found someone who could. I felt small, humiliated, invisible in a world that suddenly seemed too big, too fast, and entirely indifferent. I didn't know it yet, but that moment, the rain, the betrayal, the creeping sense of inadequacy, was just the beginning. The real storm was still to come, and I had no idea how completely my life was about to be overturned. I never saw it coming, not really. I had my suspicions, the nagging little voice in my head that whispered warnings during quiet moments, but I buried it under hope, under love, under the desperate need to believe that Mara would never leave me for someone else. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was imagining patterns where there were none. But deep down, I always knew she had this restless streak, a hunger for something bigger than the life I could give her. I just didn't want to admit it, because admitting it meant facing a truth I wasn't ready for, the truth that I might never be enough. It was December 23, 2017, a gray Sunday that smelled like wet asphalt and the faint sweetness of chestnuts roasting from a street vendor down the block. I had promised Mara we'd do something together before the holidays, something small, intimate, just the two of us. I'd saved up a little extra for my overtime shifts, bought her a scarf in a shade of deep burgundy I knew she loved, and wrapped it carefully in cheap but festive paper. I imagined her smile, the warmth in her eyes when she'd see it, and for a moment, I felt like I was part of a story worth telling. I found her at the corner cafe she loved, the one with the cracked neon sign that buzzed inconsistently. She was there before me, sitting with a cup of chai latte, scrolling through her phone with that familiar intensity, that magnetic focus that had first drawn me to her. I waved, and she looked up, smiled faintly, but it wasn't the smile I knew. Something had shifted. The light in her eyes that usually flickered with warmth was dimmed, cautious. And then I saw him, Julian. He was leaning casually against the wall outside the cafe, sunglasses on even though it was overcast, a designer coat draped over one shoulder, and the kind of aura that screams wealth without even trying. He didn't need to speak to dominate the room. His presence alone did it. My heart sank in a way I didn't know it could. That little voice in my head screamed, and for once I let it, because I couldn't ignore the reality unfolding before me. Mara waved at him, smiled, and he stepped inside. I forced my grin, told myself it was fine, that I could handle a friend, even if that friend had every advantage I could never hope to match. I remember the conversation, though it was mostly polite words exchanged, small talk that felt hollow. Julian was charming, effortless, rich in ways I couldn't compete with, and Mara, she seemed alive in a way she never had been with me. I tried to focus on her laugh, on the way the burgundy scarf I'd planned to give her would look around her neck, but it felt like grasping at smoke. Later, she left the cafe with Julian, hand brushing mine for just a second, a touch that felt like a lie. I walked home alone, the streets slick and reflective under the dim holiday lights, my chest tight with disbelief and heartbreak. I remember thinking that maybe I had been blind, maybe I had been too trusting, too willing to believe in a love that existed only in my head. It wasn't long after that the messages started. Short, casual, innocent on the surface, but sharp beneath. She'd tell me about Julian's latest plans, the gifts he bought her, the trips he was planning, the apartment he'd taken her to view. Each message was like a hammer, striking me in the chest over and over. I tried to smile through it, tried to tell myself it didn't matter, that I could survive this, that I could somehow make it through without losing all sense of self. But the breaking point came in January, after Christmas, when reality hit me in full force. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, the tiny lamp casting a weak glow over my cluttered apartment, when her message came through. It wasn't long, just a few lines, but it changed everything. She told me Julian had asked her to move in with him, that they were planning to start the new year together in a better place, a fresh start, as she put it. I couldn't breathe. I remember gripping the edge of the table until my knuckles went white, staring at my phone as if it had betrayed me personally. My mind was a whirlwind of disbelief, anger, and self-loathing. How could she do this? After everything we'd shared, every small, painstaking effort I'd made to show her I cared? Did she ever feel anything for me, or was I just a placeholder until someone better came along? I called her, my hands shaking, my voice cracking even before I said a word. I wanted to scream, to cry, to beg, to demand answers. But when she answered, she was calm, almost amused, and I realized then that the person I had loved was no longer the person sitting across from me in that cafe months ago. She had moved on in every sense, emotionally, materially, completely. She told me it wasn't personal, that she just wanted more, that Julian could give her things I couldn't. And for the first time, I understood what she really meant when she had said, "He's different." The next weeks were a blur. I went to work mechanically, avoided friends, and walked the streets at night, hoping to lose myself in the city's chaos. I replayed every memory, every laugh, every touch, trying to figure out where I went wrong, where I had failed. But the truth was, I hadn't failed. I had loved her honestly, fully, without expectation. She had failed me, yes, but more than that, she had failed herself, chasing a life built on surface-level things, a life I could never provide and never compete with. One evening, about a month after she left, I stumbled across her social media again. She had moved in with Julian, posting pictures of lavish dinners, expensive gifts, weekends in Manhattan, vacations abroad. She looked happy, radiant even, and I felt my stomach twist in ways I didn't know were possible. It wasn't jealousy exactly, it was mourning. I was mourning the version of her I loved, the life we could have had, and the innocence of believing that love alone could be enough. That's when the first real anger began to seep in. Not the kind that bursts out in yelling or punching walls, but the quiet, simmering kind that sits in your chest and claws at you, demanding recognition. I realized I wasn't just sad or heartbroken, I was furious at the injustice of it all. The universe felt cruel, or maybe it was simply indifferent, and I was left to navigate the wreckage. It's strange how betrayal reshapes you. One moment, you are whole. The next, you are fractured in ways you can't repair. I felt smaller than ever, yet in that very smallness, a seed of clarity began to grow. I didn't know what I would do with it yet, but I knew this: I couldn't stay frozen in pain. Something had to give, whether it was action, revenge, or simply survival. By February, I had become a ghost in my own life. Friends noticed I was quieter, more withdrawn, but I brushed it off. At work, I was polite, efficient, but distant. My thoughts were always with her, with the life she had chosen over me, with Julian and the gilded cage she now occupied. I couldn't stop thinking about the way she had mocked my life, the way she had looked down on my modest apartment, my thrifted clothes, my ordinary existence. Those memories, which once seemed minor, now stung like open wounds. And then, one rainy afternoon, an anonymous tip arrived, through a friend who had run into someone from her circle. Julian wasn't who she thought he was. The apartment, not fully his. The vacations, mostly credit cards, loans, promises. The luxurious lifestyle, a facade. She had left for someone wealthy, yes, but he was a gambler, a fraud, a man teetering on the edge of financial ruin. The reality hit me like a tidal wave, a mix of shock, disbelief, and something I hadn't felt in months, a strange, cautious hope. I felt like life had handed me a second chance, a way to witness the consequences of choices made without heart. But there was also the bitter taste of justice not yet served, of a story still unfolding, and I realized then that my journey wasn't over. In fact, the hardest, most painful, yet strangely satisfying chapters were about to begin. The weeks after that revelation were disorienting, like walking through a world where nothing made sense anymore. I had spent months drowning in heartbreak, in the slow erosion of my self-esteem, but now there was this strange, uneasy energy, half dread, half anticipation. I couldn't stop thinking about Mara, not out of love anymore, but out of this strange compulsion to witness the consequences of choices made without care. It was almost morbid, the way my mind clung to her every social media post, every mention, every fragment of news. I'd like to say I moved on gracefully, but that would be a lie. I became a shadow, wandering through my own life with a kind of deliberate numbness. Work became a refuge, though even there I wasn't truly present. Bagging groceries, stocking shelves, interacting with strangers, I went through the motions while my brain spun endlessly around Mara, Julian, and the unraveling threads of what I had once believed was love. My roommates noticed, my friends noticed, even the customers sometimes did. Some asked if I was okay. I smiled, nodded, said the usual "I'm fine," but inside, I was unraveling. I started avoiding the places we used to go together. The cafe where I'd hoped to surprise her with that burgundy scarf sat empty in my mind like a grave marker. The pier where we'd walked, laughing, felt like it belonged to someone else, a memory I couldn't inhabit anymore. Every familiar street, every familiar sound, became a trigger. Even the city itself seemed to mock me, the neon lights too bright, the subway too loud, the air too sharp. Friends tried to pull me out of it. Marcus, my roommate from college, invited me to parties, to movies, to weekend hikes. I appreciated it, really, I did, but I couldn't shake the feeling that no one could fill the void Mara had left. And more than that, I didn't want them to. I didn't want to forget the pain because, in a strange way, it had become a part of me. A harsh teacher, yes, but a teacher nonetheless. Work was where I found both solace and frustration. My manager, Mrs. Kaplan, a sharp woman in her 50s with a penchant for scolding anyone who dawdled, noticed I was distracted. She cornered me one evening, a clipboard in hand, eyebrows raised. "Everything all right?" she asked. I smiled weakly, nodded, and muttered something about being tired. She didn't press further, and I was grateful. That night, I lingered in the empty aisles after closing, staring at the fluorescent lights reflecting off the polished floors, thinking about the life I wanted versus the life I had, and wondering if Mara had realized just how shallow Julian's world really was. Then came the first real crack in my own psyche. One Friday, I came home to find a letter slipped under my door. It was from Mara. I still remember the smell of the envelope, faintly floral, faintly metallic. My hands shook as I tore it open. She wrote that she missed me, that she hoped I was doing well, that Julian wasn't as perfect as she thought. She didn't mention the apartment, the debts, the lies, not directly, but I could read between the lines. Every word felt like a dagger, a reminder that I was still tethered to her in ways I couldn't sever. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I folded the letter carefully, placed it in a drawer, and left it there like a secret relic of a life that no longer existed. But the letter stirred something in me, a spark of clarity. If she had moved on, if she had chosen Julian over me, then I had two choices: wallow in bitterness or rise above it. The latter seemed impossible at the time, but I clung to the idea like a lifeline. My family noticed the change too. My mother, who had always been a quiet presence in my life, called me one evening after weeks of silence. "You've been distant," she said gently. "Is everything okay?" I told her I was fine, but I lied. I couldn't bring myself to admit the humiliation, the betrayal, the slow unraveling of everything I had thought I knew about love and trust. She didn't press, but I could hear the concern in her voice. And that concern made the emptiness feel heavier, like a weight pressing down on my chest that I couldn't shake. Even Julian's presence haunted me indirectly. He didn't reach out directly, at least not at first, but I'd hear whispers through mutual friends, see tags in photos, and feel the sting of Mara's choices in ways that made my teeth clench with both anger and helplessness. He was everything I wasn't, or at least he seemed to be, and the contrast cut deep. But deep down, I held on to the fragile hope that the glittering life he presented wasn't all it seemed. The mental toll was real. I started having trouble sleeping, nightmares creeping in of Mara and Julian, of her laughing at my expense, of my life dissolving into a montage of missed chances and broken promises. My appetite waned, my focus faltered, and I began to feel unmoored, like a boat adrift in a stormy sea. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, yet I didn't know where to begin fixing it. Then came the turning point, small and almost imperceptible. I noticed a post on social media from a mutual acquaintance, Mara complaining, subtly, about Julian. Something about unpaid bills, about him disappearing for days, about arguments she didn't want to broadcast. My heart leapt, not out of joy, not exactly, but out of something darker, validation. She had chosen wealth and status over genuine love, and now that choice was cracking, revealing the fragility beneath the glitter. I started piecing things together, trying to verify the gossip, observing from a distance, calculating. I wasn't vengeful, not yet, but I felt a shift in my own energy, a movement from helplessness to awareness. Every post Mara made that hinted at Julian's failings was like a breadcrumb, leading me somewhere I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to go. Work became my anchor. I threw myself into overtime, into extra shifts, into the mechanical rhythms of stocking shelves and organizing deliveries. My body ached, yes, but my mind began to clear. I wasn't escaping Mara's shadow completely, but I was learning to navigate around it, to reclaim pieces of myself I had lost in the grief and humiliation. I even started noticing small things I had ignored before, the kindness of co-workers, the quiet satisfaction of a perfectly organized aisle, the way the evening sunlight hit the rooftops when I walked home. These small details became lifelines, reminders that the world hadn't ended, even if my personal world had fractured. One evening, while walking past a coffee shop we had once frequented together, I caught a glimpse of Mara through the window. She looked tired, frustrated even, her designer coat slightly rumpled, Julian nowhere in sight. I didn't approach, didn't wave, didn't make eye contact. But inside, a strange satisfaction settled in, a quiet, almost imperceptible sense that life had a way of balancing itself, even if slowly and painfully. I realized then that my story wasn't just about heartbreak. It was about resilience, about the messy, complicated, unpredictable journey of reclaiming oneself after betrayal. By early spring, I was starting to feel more like myself again. Not fully healed, not fully whole, but alive in a way I hadn't been in months. The anger had not vanished. It had transformed into something more deliberate, more focused. I knew the next steps wouldn't be easy, that the path ahead was still fraught with challenges, but for the first time, I felt capable of walking it on my own terms. The fallout had stripped me bare, yes, but in doing so, it revealed a truth I couldn't ignore. Life was unpredictable, love was fragile, and people were often not who they seemed. But within that chaos, there was power, even if it came quietly, even if it came wrapped in pain and humiliation. And I was ready, however cautiously, to claim it. By mid-2018, I had reached a strange equilibrium. My life, though still modest, had a rhythm I could rely on. I wasn't the broken, hollow shell I had been the winter Mara left me. I was someone who had endured, survived, and begun to sharpen the edges of my resilience. There was still a flicker of anger, yes, a burning sense of injustice, but it had become something useful, a tool, a compass pointing me toward a course I hadn't dared consider before, reclaiming my dignity, asserting my self-worth, and quietly observing the unraveling of a life built on superficial choices. It started innocuously enough. I noticed small cracks in Mara and Julian's facade through social media and mutual acquaintances. She had moved into a high-rise in Manhattan's Upper East Side with him, boasting a lifestyle I could never afford, but the veneer was thin. Posts about lavish dinners were occasionally paired with subtle complaints, delayed payments, arguments over bills, or cryptic captions like, "Some promises are easier broken than kept." Julian, it seemed, was all charm and no substance. He was extravagant, yes, but reckless, disorganized, and entirely incapable of sustaining the lifestyle he had promised. At first, I told myself to ignore it. It wasn't my business, after all, and I had my own life to rebuild. But the more I observed, the more my anger evolved into something sharper, something deliberate. I wanted her to see the consequences of the choices she had made, not through cruelty, but as an undeniable truth she couldn't avoid. I began quietly documenting everything. Social media posts, overheard conversations through friends, public records about Julian's business dealings and debts. I was meticulous, almost obsessively so. I didn't want to act out of petty vengeance. I wanted the facts, the undeniable reality. There was a satisfaction in watching the facade crack on its own. Every complaint she posted, every financial slip, every subtle frustration was a breadcrumb in a trail she had unknowingly left for me to follow. Meanwhile, I focused on my own life. I started taking courses online, learning skills that could help me move beyond the grocery store job that had once defined me. Coding, digital marketing, small business management. I wanted something that would make me independent, something that gave me leverage over my own circumstances. I began saving aggressively, living frugally, and slowly, imperceptibly, building a foundation that Mara could never mock or belittle. It wasn't about showing her, not exactly. It was about reclaiming my agency. Then, the opportunity came. In late 2018, through a mutual friend, I discovered that Julian had lost a substantial sum in a poorly managed investment. His debts were mounting, the apartment was at risk, and the lifestyle he had promised was unraveling faster than either of them could comprehend. I won't lie, part of me felt a rush of vindication. Here was the shiny, perfect life Mara had chased, disintegrating before her eyes. But more than that, I felt clarity. Life had a way of balancing itself, and I was no longer a passive observer. I reached out indirectly, carefully. Not to Mara, not in anger, not in malice, but to ensure that the truth she had ignored was undeniable. I shared factual evidence with mutual acquaintances, people she trusted, letting the story emerge naturally. It wasn't gossip, it was reality documented and undeniable. Slowly, subtly, the web of lies and false appearances began to collapse around her. One evening in January 2019, I stumbled upon the first real evidence of her unraveling world. Julian had skipped rent on the Manhattan apartment, defaulted on several payments, and their accounts were being frozen by creditors. Mara posted a vague, panicked status about unexpected challenges and learning who your real friends are. I felt a quiet, grim satisfaction reading those words. Not cruelty, not schadenfreude, but the calm knowledge that reality had caught up with them both. It was a slow process, and I didn't interfere directly. I watched, listened, and let the consequences unfold naturally. I began to rebuild my life in parallel. By spring, I had a steady freelance gig in digital marketing, a small but reliable income, and the confidence that came from creating stability out of chaos. I wasn't wealthy by any measure, but I was independent, self-sufficient, and no longer defined by Mara's perception of my worth. The turning point came in June 2019. I received a text from a mutual friend, an indirect, innocuous note, but it confirmed what I had suspected. Mara and Julian were now financially and emotionally estranged. He had left her, and she was struggling, penniless, reliant on borrowed money, and confronted daily with the consequences of the choices she had made. The woman who had once mocked my thrifted clothes and modest apartment was now facing the reality of a life built on superficial promises, stripped of the wealth and glamour she had once idolized. I felt a mix of emotions, relief, vindication, but also a profound sense of melancholy. I had wanted her to understand the gravity of her choices, yes, but I hadn't wanted her to suffer entirely. I realized then that my actions hadn't been about revenge in the traditional sense. They had been about reclaiming my own narrative, asserting my dignity, and witnessing the truth emerge without deceit or malice. Around the same time, I reconnected with people I had neglected during the heartbreak. Friends, family, even colleagues. I realized that while Mara and Julian's collapse was significant, my own growth, resilience, and self-respect were the true victories. I started dating again cautiously, slowly, recognizing the value of honesty, integrity, and compatibility over superficial wealth or charm. By the end of 2019, I had moved into a slightly larger apartment in Queens, one that I could afford without strain, decorated simply but warmly, a reflection of the life I had built with my own hands. I walked past the cafe where Mara and I had spent so many evenings, now a stranger in its doorway, and I felt nothing but calm. No longing, no resentment, just a quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing you've survived, grown, and emerged intact from the storm. Mara reached out once, months later, hesitant, apologetic, perhaps ashamed. She asked if we could meet, if we could talk. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I had watched the consequences unfold, had reclaimed my life, and no longer required validation from someone who had once rejected me for a life she could never sustain. The world had a strange way of righting itself, and I had learned to let it. What I had once believed was a cruel twist of fate, being abandoned for someone wealthier, had become a profound lesson in resilience, self-respect, and the subtle power of patience. Mara had left for wealth and status, and while she had suffered in the aftermath, I had gained something far more enduring, a life rebuilt on my own terms, dignity intact, and a confidence that no betrayal could ever fully take away. By the time 2020 rolled around, the world itself felt like it was shifting under everyone's feet. The pandemic hit, cities emptied, routines shattered, and people were forced to confront the fragility of everything they had taken for granted. In a way, it mirrored the transformation I had already undergone. My own life, already rebuilt from betrayal and heartbreak, now felt anchored against a world that was suddenly chaotic and unpredictable. I had learned, painfully and slowly, how to stand firm when everything else seemed to crumble. Mara had disappeared from my life almost entirely. The social media posts that had once haunted me became sporadic, vague, and soon stopped altogether. Through mutual friends, I heard she was living in a small apartment in Brooklyn, working multiple jobs to stay afloat. Julian, predictably, had vanished. The man who had promised wealth and adventure had left her with nothing, a stark contrast to the glittering life she had once flaunted. I felt a mix of pity and detachment. There was no satisfaction in it anymore, no need to gloat. It was simply the natural order of consequences, life balancing itself quietly and efficiently. For me, the quiet aftermath was liberating. I had built stability in my work and personal life. My freelance projects had grown, and I even managed to invest a little in savings and small ventures, things I had never imagined I could do back when Mara had mocked my thrifted existence. But beyond material success, what mattered most was the inner transformation. I had learned boundaries, self-worth, and the power of patience. I no longer sought validation from anyone else. Love, approval, admiration, they all became secondary to the integrity I had carved into my own life. It wasn't an overnight change. Some mornings, I'd wake up and feel the ghost of Mara's laughter, her teasing, the sting of her betrayal. But those feelings were no longer anchors. They were reminders of how far I had come, how much I had endured, and how resilient the human spirit could be when pushed to its limits. I had learned to carry the past without letting it define the present, and that was a power I had once thought impossible. By the fall of 2021, I had even started to entertain the idea of a future beyond survival. I met people through work, through friends, through casual encounters, slowly allowing trust to rebuild in small increments. I didn't rush. I was careful, deliberate. I was no longer the person who would bend entirely for love, who would excuse cruelty or mockery for a fleeting sense of companionship. I had learned the art of self-preservation, of valuing myself enough to step away from toxicity without guilt. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I reflected on the chain of events that had brought me here. I thought about Mara, about Julian, about the choices we make in pursuit of desire, status, or convenience. I thought about the anger, the heartbreak, the months of walking through the world feeling invisible. And I realized something profound. The real victory was not in witnessing her downfall, nor in any material success I had achieved. The victory was in reclaiming my life, in learning to love and respect myself even when someone else had refused to see my value. One evening, in late October, I walked past the pier where Mara and I had once strolled, the faint smell of salt in the air, the hum of the city around me. I stopped, leaned against the railing, and let the memories wash over me. There was no bitterness, no longing, just a calm, quiet acknowledgement that life had unfolded as it should. That the choices we make, the people we are, and the integrity we uphold, all have consequences, whether immediate or delayed. I smiled, a small, private smile, because I knew that despite all the pain, all the humiliation, all the heartbreak, I had emerged intact. Stronger, wiser, and capable of weathering storms I once thought insurmountable. Mara had mocked me for being poor, left for someone wealthier, and in the end, life had revealed the truth without my intervention. Julian had left her penniless, and she had been forced to confront the reality she had so eagerly pursued. But for me, the real resolution was internal. I had survived betrayal and humiliation, yes, but more importantly, I had built a life of dignity, independence, and quiet confidence. I don't think of Mara with hatred anymore. I don't even think of her often. She became a chapter, a lesson, a story that shaped me in ways I never anticipated. I still remember the pain, the sleepless nights, the moments of despair, but those memories no longer haunt me. They guide me, remind me of my own resilience, and the strength that can emerge from heartbreak. Life moves on, and so did I. I found joy in simple things: a warm cup of coffee on a quiet morning, the hum of the city streets beneath my feet, the satisfaction of a project completed well, friends who had stood by me, laughter that wasn't shadowed by worry or insecurity. I even found love again, slowly, cautiously, but with a foundation built on respect, understanding, and shared values. Not wealth, not status, but connection. And sometimes, when I catch a fleeting glimpse of Mara's past life through mutual friends, or hear whispers of her struggles, I feel a quiet satisfaction. Not vengeance, not schadenfreude, but the understanding that life has a way of balancing itself. The choices we make, the values we prioritize, the people we hurt or neglect, they all have consequences, sometimes immediate, sometimes delayed, always inevitable. I never sought to humiliate her, never wished for her suffering. I simply lived, rebuilt, and grew. And in the end, that growth, that resilience, that unwavering commitment to my own dignity became the real story. Mara left for wealth, chased after illusion, and found hardship instead. I stayed true to myself, even when it was hardest, and found a life of substance, stability, and quiet, enduring satisfaction. The city lights flickered on that night, rain-slick streets glowing beneath me, and I realized that the pain, the betrayal, the heartbreak, all of it, had forged me into someone I could trust to navigate life on my own terms. I was no longer defined by someone else's choices or mockery. I was defined by my strength, my perseverance, and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that even in the darkest moments, life has a way of delivering justice, clarity, and sometimes, an unexpected redemption. And so I walked home that night, not bitter, not vengeful, but fully alive. Free in a way I had never been before, carrying the lessons of the past without letting them weigh me down. I had endured, I had grown, and in the end, that was more than enough.